All right, so this is a super common question. How can you have a bunch of molds that create mycotoxins, but then you don't have mycotoxins in the house? The answer is actually really simple. Just because a mold has the ability to create a mycotoxin doesn't mean it actually does, okay? The mycotoxins are what's called a secondary metabolite of molds, meaning that they don't always produce them. So kind of think of it this way. You have all these different type of mold types. Some of them have the ability to produce a mycotoxin and some of them don't. So the some that don't get pulled out right away. And then you have the some that do. Now the some that do, just because they can doesn't mean they always will, okay? So they create mycotoxins as a defense mechanism. So for example, let's say this is your mold colony, and as long as nothing is coming to sort of interfere or try to take over its territory, it has no reason to defend itself, right? Because it's all about defense. But if other molds or bacteria are starting to work its way into its territory and starting to expand in, then it will spring into action and try to protect itself. The way it does that is it creates a chemical that kind of covers the colony like lava over a volcano, and it creates kind of like a toxic moat, okay? So then as this other stuff is coming over, it hits this toxic stuff and it kills it, and that's how it protects itself. So what happens is because it covered its entire sort of colony in this toxin, now any spores or any fragments or anything that break off of this colony from that point forward, that's all going to be carrying the toxin. But the thing to think about is that mycotoxins are not like a gun that's shot out or spray or anything like that, right? It really is kind of this sort of covering like lava over a volcano. And the reason that we get exposed to it is because if it happens and then stuff comes off of it, that starts floating around. And because it's a chemical that's kind of sitting on that particle, we breathe in the particle, so ultimately it's still a particle issue, but that particle now has a chemical on it, and that is the chemical, and that's how we breathe it in, all right? Imagine you are sitting in front of your door, your front door. You have a gun sitting on your table next to you. You have a loaded gun sitting here on the table next to you. Now, you're not just going to pick up that gun and start shooting around for no reason. I mean, most people wouldn't anyways, right? So the gun's just going to stay there. There's no reason to pick it up, no reason to shoot it. Now, let's say somebody busts in your front door and they scared you and they're trying to rob you. They're trying to do all this stuff, right? Well, now you have two options. You can either pick up the gun and shoot it, or you don't, right? Just because somebody busted in to break into your house doesn't mean you're automatically picking up the gun and shooting that person, right? So that's kind of like the analogy that's here. Obviously, like shooting guns, is different than this kind of chemical overflow that we're talking about. The concept is there. Just because the toxin has the ability to create it doesn't mean that it will. You have a higher probability of that happening if you have a whole bunch of different issues going on, and specifically in the same area where all the growth is happening, right? If there's a lot of fighting over territory in the growth or in that area, then you have a higher likelihood of mycotoxins happening. But I would tell you that we detect mycotoxins about 25% of the time when we're testing. So if you had a mycotoxin test that you did and it came back negative, that's not like a crazy thing to happen. We actually see it come back negative more often than positive. And this is why you can't just rely on a mycotoxin test in your house. This is why you actually need to be doing dust testing to understand mold speciation, right? Because if we just relied on a mycotoxin test, 75% of the time that comes up as a negative. And that's the only thing that we're looking at. And we might be missing this other big thing over here, which is a whole bunch of molds that are growing. They just haven't produced the toxin. But just because they haven't produced the toxin doesn't mean that they aren't capable of creating immune responses as well. So that's why in a sampling plan, we always look at both of them. And it's so important to see the full scope of what's going on. The toxigenic portion is important because that could change what remediation looks like on the back end, the process that we need to do to essentially extract a chemical toxin that's kind of been traveling around on, and settling on different surfaces. That's a more complex, comprehensive remediation plan than if maybe you just have a bunch of particle floating around and there's no mycotoxins there. There's a break-even point almost on this side of it, though. Like if the load is so high, we found that implementing this more aggressive plan is really what's needed on that. If your load of particle, mold fragments, things that are picked up in dust samples are extremely high, then a lot of times you do need a more aggressive cleaning plan, but there's some times that you don't, right? So that's why you test for both things. That's why you can have mycotoxins or not mycotoxins present, and sort of the explanation of how those two things work together.